Back in 2020, I created the Tudor Chest. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my main social media platform on Instagram at the Tudor Chest. On this page, I release daily insight into the world of the Tudors, from portrait discussions to film and book reviews, my observations, new discoveries, Q&As, and so on. My Instagram account is the place where I most regularly update content, and being Instagram, it's all free of charge. To check that out, again, it's at the Tudor Chest. Dr. Linda Porter is a historian and author who has just released her 6th book, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. She joins me today for a discussion all about King Henry VIII's older sister, who reigned as Queen of Scotland beside her husband, King James IV. Margaret weathered many storms, including the difficulty of her first husband going to war against her native homeland, and then the disasters of her second and third marriages, respectively. Margaret does, however, have a major legacy, one still extremely present in British identity today. And in Linda's book, she explores this fascinating character who for too long has been all but overlooked. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 50, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor with Dr. Linda Porter. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Linda Porter, how are you doing?
I'm all right, thank you, Adam.
So before we get into the discussion today, which is about your new book, Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor, just wanted to ask you a few icebreaker, get-to-know-you questions just for anybody who may not know who you are and what you do. So could you provide me with just a short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full-time?
I was born in Devon, in Exeter, a city that I'm very proud to be associated with, actually, because I think it's still a fine city. I left there when I was quite young, at the age of 6, and moved up to the southeast to the London area because my father worked for the old GPO, the General Post Office, and he got promoted. And in those days, you came up to London normally under those circumstances. So I was brought up in the southeast of England, in Kent. I went to local primary schools and actually passed the exam that I think hardly exists anymore, though it probably does still exist here, the 11 plus exam, and went on a free place to a type of school that doesn't exist anymore. It's called a direct grant school. It's now independent, but they were a private school, but they got a grant from the government, and you had to take, as a result of that, 25% of the pupils for free places. So I was one of those. The fact that this led to certain not necessarily positive social interactions between the pupils, we will probably gloss over at the moment, but it is an interesting thought nevertheless. And then eventually I did my A-levels and went to the University of York to read history. So I have both my bachelor's and my doctorate, my DPhil from the University of York. Since then, I've had a fairly varied career. I lectured for a while in New York when I lived there at various universities, including Fordham and one or two others. When I returned to the UK, I couldn't get an academic post, so I had to work full time. And I worked for nearly a quarter of a century in corporate relations for BT. And then I took early retirement and decided I wanted to go back to historical research and writing, which is what I've done ever since. And have since published six books, the most recent being the one you just alluded to. So that's really my background, I suppose.
Can you remember a particular moment, maybe in your childhood, or something that sparked your passion for history and in particular Tudor history?
Yes, I can, though my interest in Tudor history is much more recent than my childhood, actually, I suppose. But when we first moved to Sevenoaks in Kent, where I lived on and off ever since, not all the time. I've lived in New York and Paris as well. I we rented a house. It was a large, old-fashioned, I would guess probably Edwardian house, and all of the rooms had were lined with bookcases, floor to ceiling, even the bedrooms.
Wow.
And my father's parents, my grandparents, came to stay one time. And my grandfather lifted off the bookshelves a book called Our Island Story. And he said, look at this. This has got very interesting pictures in it. Now, I wasn't very interested in the pictures, but I was interested in the story. And of course, I had no idea until many years later that H.E. Marshall was Henrietta Elizabeth Marshall and that it was written by a woman. And I think for people of my generation, although it can be criticized for being, imperialistic and all that sort of thing, it's not as bad as some that came out of that
Mm.
period. And our sort of knowledge of English, and to a much more minor degree, some elements of Scottish history as well, was probably based on that. And much of what she wrote was actually based on Shakespeare and some of the chronicles on which he actually based his plays. And a lot of it is wrong and very old-fashioned. But most of what I knew about the progress of English history stemmed from that. And it was, I absolutely loved it as a child. I would define myself now actually as a Tudor and Stuart historian, and
Right.
I would prefer to concentrate on the Stuarts, but the Tudors sell better. So if you want to write and be published, you have to be somewhat pragmatic about this, I think. So I was sitting in my living room one day, and I had learned quite a lot by then, and I think the background in business helps. I had learned, first of all, and this is back in 2005 or 2006, that it needed to be an important person, a major person, a monarch basically, or if not someone just at the level below that, someone who was controversial, someone who hadn't been written about in a more accessible way for quite some time. And just out of nowhere, the name Mary the First popped into
Mm.
my head. And I did a proposal, and my agent said, we can sell this. And in fact, we got several offers for it, because it had what people wanted. It had parental abuse, it had sibling rivalries, it had, unhappy marriage, all of these things. And she was a woman, of course, and our first queen regnant. So I think it resonated with a lot of people. And I'm still very proud of it and very fond of it as my first book. There's some wonderful Marian scholars around at the moment, who are moving things on in a very admirable way. But because she was a Tudor, obviously, I stuck with the Tudors for my next book, which was on Catherine Parr. And I only went back to the Tudors because we couldn't place the book I wanted to write, which was on the last year of Marie Antoinette's life. And nobody wanted it. And
Really?
in fact, various American publishers came back saying, this is very grim. It's a very sad
Yeah.
story. So I thought, well, the bloody hell do you expect it to be? It's not going to be a laugh a minute, is it? But anyhow, because I had done a lot of research for the third book, Crown of Thistles, I had a great deal of material on Margaret Tudor. She's in it, but she's not entirely
Mm.
about her, obviously. And I said at the time, I think, she's very much overdue a more balanced biography. She's probably one of the most forgotten and misunderstood major
Mm.
Tudor figures. And it proved somewhat less easy to write in reality than I'd hoped it might be, because when you have to revisit certain things you've written about previously, like the Battle of Flodden, it you can't just import stuff willy-nilly from another book. You have to look at it differently. And it is a bit of a challenge, but hopefully it's one that I overcame. So that's where I am now, basically.
So before we get into a discussion about your book and Margaret Tudor, I just wondered if you had a Tudor pet peeve, something that really grinds your gears that you see a lot.
I do, yes. It's a good question, Adam, but yes, I do. And I thought about that a bit beforehand. I think what I object to most is what I would call the Disneyfication of the Tudors. this it's perpetuated in historical novels and on not all TV programs about the Tudors, but it's certainly perhaps the majority of them, that these people are just like us, but in fancy dress. And they're not just like us. And indeed, if they were, why would they be interesting? Their whole interest is that they are very, very different from us. They lived in an entirely different world. It, it's the things that were valued in it are not necessarily by any means the things that are valued now. I mean, I think the great emphasis on family as almost above any other consideration, particularly in the world we live in nowadays, would seem curious to most people. And I think the kind of prettification of all of this has led especially to a disturbing sort of trend amongst many young women who see in some, if not all, of Henry VIII's six wives, some sort of strident feminism, which is rubbish. I mean, they simply would not have understood the concept and probably disapproved of it if they did. But a sort of trend that, I'd really like to have been one of their friends. And this is naive rubbish, because the whole point of being a queen, especially if you were a queen regnant, but also to some degree if you were a queen consort, is that you were different from everyone else. And you might even question whether even amongst their ladies who were close to them, they actually had friends. They would have had close relationships. But I think if you tried to explain to Elizabeth I that some of the women who served her were her friends, you would have got the sharp end of her tongue. Because, it's just not what not what monarchy was about. Its whole point was that it was other, and your only relationship was with God, really. So I do find all of that quite disturbing. I suppose the counter argument is that the more people who read more generally, and there are some very good historical novels as well as some that are absolutely hopeless, but there are some good ones, and particularly the drama documentaries do their best, though not often terribly effectively, I don't think, to give perhaps a more balanced view of what the past was like. But I suppose if it interests people in history and the period, it's good. I'm just not quite sure what, to use a modern phrase, their takeaway is.
Yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? Because on the one hand, things like, I mean, I'm very critical of the series The Tudors, the television drama The Tudors. I thought it was frothy nonsense. It irritated me, but it's beloved and it draws a lot of people towards the Tudors, which is a good thing. But I find to your point, the sort of the dumbing down, the Disneyfication of it, I mean, one of the things that drove me mad about the Tudors is actually quite topical about our discussion today, is that Henry VIII, it would have seemed too confusing for the audience for Henry to have both sisters, so they merged the stories of, they amalgamated it, called her Margaret, but the story was more Mary, but she was marrying the Portuguese king, not the French. I just thought, for Christ's sake, the audience can understand he had two sisters.
Yes, they can. And also, I mean, as you well know, our past is dramatic enough in itself.
Precisely.
And I don't see why you have to introduce total inaccuracies and irrelevance into it. But they still do. There are obviously commercial views behind all of this, but I think it does still annoy historians a great. It's also one of the more challenging things about being a historical consultant on any kind of series, I think. I mean, it depends how much you're willing to bend with the wind, I think. I mean, I've had a few experiences of historical consultants, and they haven't all been good. I had one absolutely brilliant one with Lucy Worsley on Lucy Worsley's Six Wives. But I've had some others, better be nameless, that have not been quite so good. And I mean, it is curious, I think. I mean, if you take one example, the Becoming Elizabeth program, which I didn't like very much.
Oh, I loved
there were
it.
certain things. There were certain things about it. I didn't like the portrayal of Catherine Parr very much.
No, that wasn't good.
No, it wasn't good. You're right. There were other quite good aspects in it, but mostly, I mean, those of us who are on social media, if we're involved in consultancy, we do post about it. But the consultant for becoming Elizabeth kept very, very, very quiet. She's an academic at the University of Durham, I think. I don't think she ever posted a word about it. And one doesn't know what that means. And I do know at least one prominent Tudor historian who insisted on having her name taken off the credits of a program that she'd been consultant on. So it's kind of a poison chalice, I think.
I enjoyed Becoming Elizabeth. It had its faults, but I actually think that what I thought was best about Becoming Elizabeth is that I felt it finally did a service to Mary.
Yes, it did. No, you're quite right about that.
It was the first performance that felt nuanced, that wasn't a caricature, when I was speaking to Claire Ridgway about this, and it should have been called Becoming Mary because she was easily the best thing about it and came across really well.
Yes, that's a very good point. Yes, no, you're right.
The purpose of today, as we said at the start of the episode, is to discuss your latest book, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor, who is obviously the older sister of King Henry VIII. So to start with Margaret's birth, can you tell me a bit about where was Margaret born? And was there any indication that her sex was a disappointment to her parents, and I suppose in particular to Henry VII?
She was born in London, in Westminster, in fact. There's still some dispute, and I could never quite get to the bottom of it. Some people say she was born on the 28th of November, 1489, others on the 29th. But the truth of the matter is it's late November, at any rate, 1489. And the interesting thing is that there is a 3-year gap between Margaret and her elder brother, Prince Arthur. And we simply don't know whether Elizabeth of York had not conceived during that time, whether she'd had one or more miscarriages or one or more stillbirths. We don't know. That there is nothing in the historical record to indicate that. But there isn't anything to indicate that they were disappointed with the birth of a girl. I mean, they were actually extraordinarily affectionate parents by the standards of European monarchies, not just then, but probably now as well. And of course, having a daughter, if you've already got a healthy son, does introduce the possibility of diplomatic alliances. So it is not necessarily something to be concerned about. And of course, after Margaret, Elizabeth of York gave birth much more regularly. You know, Henry VIII was born in the summer of 1490. Then there were other children who followed fairly regularly throughout the 1490s. He was born in the summer of 1491. I should have said, someone will pick up on that otherwise. But there were other children who followed during the 1490s, though only Mary, of course, survived. And eventually there were at the time of Arthur's marriage, there were 4 children who appeared to be, healthy and would survive: Arthur, Margaret, Mary, and Henry and Mary, in the order they were born. So I don't think it was a disappointment. No, we know quite a lot about the christening. You know, she was christened soon after her birth because that was customary in the time in case the baby died fairly quickly, which many did. But you know, there was all the proper ceremony, and her godmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, her grandmother, gave her a substantial amount of money, you know, as a christening present. And shortly afterwards, of course, she was moved to be the first occupant of a larger royal nursery, which was based in palaces to the southeast of London. You know, places like Eltham and Richmond, which is where Margaret grew up, in those sort of palaces. She would occasionally have been at London for important state visits, really, you know, to show up as part of the royal family. And she did spend some time in the Tower of London briefly with her mother when Elizabeth took the younger children there during the West Country Revolt in the 1490s, because, you know, the rebels got as far as Blackheath. So there was obviously some danger if you were in that part of London. And she did sometimes accompany her mother on progresses in the sort of home counties area. But mostly she and Henry, and then Elizabeth and Mary and Edmund, some of the younger children didn't survive. grew up in the royal nursery, which was a very privileged and happy place, I think. They had a full staff there. The Henry was an indulgent father. If you look at the warrant books for this period in the National Archives, you can see orders for items of clothing and toys and things that would have made their childhood more easy. And they, of course, were well taught. They had a succession of tutors. Margaret and Henry were probably taught together when they were quite young, but his education might have parted from hers a bit later on. But at the time that Erasmus met them, they were all still being educated together. Though Henry's education would have had well, of course, he was destined for the clergy had his brother lived, which presents the most curious picture of the man who took us out of the Catholic Church, of course, but he was destined for it. So and being male, his education would have been a bit different from Margaret's, but she learnt all the accomplishments that would fit her to be a queen consort. She had a French tutor and spoke fluent French. She was a very talented musician, as were nearly all of the Tudors. She learnt some sort of basic arithmetic, probably a smattering of the classics. She probably have known some Latin, I think, but not a great deal. And also pursuits like archery, which she was very good at, which was considered important for highborn ladies. She also, of course, learnt more feminine skills like embroidery and things like that, and dancing. Dancing was a very important thing, and of course, the royal children were always put on a pony as soon as they could stand, virtually. So, of course, she became a very good horsewoman. And one of the things that I've said before, but I think it's worth saying again because it's an attribute which all of Henry's wives would have had, and probably was shared with other high-born women at the time, and I think is very overlooked and underrated, and that is learning how to dictate to a secretary, because as a monarch, that was the major thing you did. We have some letters that Margaret wrote in her own hand, and some letters to which she added in her own handwriting a postscript, to personalize them. But basically, the way that noble women and Queen's consort communicated was through a secretary. And as someone who has worked for many years in the corporate world with a secretary, dictation is not something that is a natural skill that people have necessarily. So to be able to do it effectively is something that was required of royal women like Margaret Tudor.
So in 1499, Margaret's aged 9, coming on 10. Negotiations began on her planned marriage to the King of Scotland, James IV. Now, what I think is quite interesting is in your book is that you make the point that historians are sometimes guilty of believing England had a real sort of natural superiority over Scotland, and that by giving their princess in marriage to Scotland, they were doing Scotland a massive favour. And you kind of refute this. I would like to just know sort of what makes you think that. You paint it really as actually this was a major coup for the Tudors.
It was in some respects because, of course, there weren't all that many eligible bachelors in Europe, and of the ones of royal blood. And James IV of Scotland would certainly have been considered preeminent amongst them. And it was hoped, though it, of course, didn't work out in the long run, and probably people didn't think it would, but it was certainly hoped that this union would, if not completely end, certainly cut down years and years of warfare over the border, which were not good for the economy of either country, incidentally, because constant raiding and burning and stealing cattle helps no one except perhaps the actual reavers, as they were called, who did it. But I mean, I think the fact that's often overlooked by English historians is that the Tudors were a new dynasty. And they'd only been on the throne for just over a decade when these marriage negotiations started, whereas the Stuarts had been on the throne of Scotland since the late 14th century. So they were a well-established monarchy. with quite strong links to Europe. Again, I think, Adam, it's worth making a point that one of the things that is always overlooked throughout much of the period of British history is that there were lands to the north called Scandinavia. And the Scots intermarried, of course, their kings quite often with Danish and Scandinavian queens. And there was a flow of trade, an important flow of trade between those countries. And of course, Scotland also had a very long-standing positive relationship with France. And although it was a small,
Old Alliance.
the old alliance, and although it was a small country with a very small population compared to England, it because of its situation, it had to be outward looking, in a sense that perhaps the English didn't really, or at least they didn't see it as much of a priority. So I think it is much more of a marriage of equals. This is a young, untested dynasty in England. And as you well know, during the 1480s and 1490s, there were constant uprisings and there were pretenders against Henry VII. He really wasn't secure on his throne until about the late 1490s. And so, marriage to his daughter wasn't necessarily viewed as such a great prize, or it wouldn't have been. Ferdinand and Isabella were obviously nervous about allying even their youngest child, Catherine of Aragon, to Prince Arthur. So, it is not a great favour bestowed upon the English to the Scots. And I think the other thing that's often overlooked is the circumstances in which James IV himself had come to the throne are actually very similar to the ones in which Henry VII had. I mean, Henry VII had a claimant to the throne for some years. James IV came to the throne in revolt against his own father, which is even more dramatic, and was only 15, whereas Henry VII was in his late 20s at the time. So on both sides of the border, there were reasons to want this alliance. I mean, James IV had not, as you know, wanted for female company. He'd had a string of mistresses, and by that time had at least, I think, 4 or 5 illegitimate children at any rate. And he had hoped, I think, perhaps in some respects, to make a more splendid marriage. Particularly, he'd approached Ferdinand and Isabella, who sent this rather sweet response saying, "Unfortunately, we haven't got any daughters left," or words to that effect. But no, he was an eligible bachelor. He was then in his late 20s. He'd bided his time to take over the reins of power in Scotland, but he'd succeeded and was experienced. And of course, he had supported Perkin Warbeck and was a thorn in Henry VII's side. So the possibility of stopping all of this, of at least dampening down border warfare, and making sure that your future son-in-law would not be supporting people who were pretenders to your throne. These are quite positive things for Henry VII to have been looking for, I think, and so it was a match with advantages on both sides.
Plans were initially to send Margaret north of the border basically straight away, but her mother and her grandmother in particular put a stop to this. Why was that?
Because they thought that she was just physically too young to enter into a marriage. I mean, 13, by the time you got to the end of your 12th year, you were considered to be an adult, of course, whether male or female. It was not unusual for noble girls, and particularly Queen's consort, to be married very young. I mean, there's often a lot of raised eyebrows and gasps in the fact that Margaret was only 13, but her mother-in-law, she would have been, who was dead by that time anyhow, had been married at the age of 12, Margaret of Denmark. So had Isabella when she married Edward II, and so was Eleanor of Provence when she married Henry III. So, it's not typical of the whole of society, because people quite often waited amongst the lower ranks, so that, if they married a bit later, particularly if the wife was a bit older, you weren't then faced with 25 years of childbearing. So it is almost a fine form of de facto contraception. But this didn't affect. It was almost the reverse for the upper echelons of society. However, it wasn't customary for girls married at the age of 12 to start sexual relations right away. And so it was, certainly if she'd been any younger than that, both Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York were concerned by what had happened to Margaret Beaufort, that at the age of 13, she'd nearly died giving birth to Henry VII, and that she was never able to have any children subsequently, which would probably have been quite a powerful argument with James IV, because you don't want to immediately impregnate your young bride only to discover that, the whole experience is so horrendous she can't produce any more children. So, in fact, he waited until she was 16, as far as we can tell. I mean, she didn't become pregnant until she was 16. Thereafter, she became pregnant regularly. So he showed a fair amount of forbearance. And of course, it wasn't that difficult for him, because at the time that he married Margaret, his then mistress, Janet Kennedy, was pregnant with their third child. So, there wasn't an alternative life, almost, if you like, which Margaret seems to have accepted, I think, partly because there isn't much you can do about it, and also because James was a very indulgent and affectionate husband. I mean, he wasn't this is going to sound terribly trite, so forgive me, but he wasn't a nasty person like Henry VIII. Henry VIII does seem to have certainly become genuinely pleasant, even if he wasn't to start off with. But James IV was never like that. And having accepted this young girl at the age of 13 as his wife, and you're right, yes, she was supposed to go a few months earlier. The proxy wedding took place in 1502. And then Elizabeth of York spent quite a lot of time training Margaret into what was necessary as a queen consort. How to manage a household, how to deal with your ladies, all that kind of thing. And of course, eventually Margaret took quite a number of her mother's ladies north with her to serve her in Scotland. But when Elizabeth of York died in the February of 1503, Margaret had been intended to go up to Scotland in the spring, and it was postponed into the latter part of the summer because of mourning and preparations and all that sort of thing. And James IV was obviously quite understanding about this. And of course, she set out from her grandmother's home on the Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire border towards the middle part of July, and actually went over the border into Scotland several weeks later at the beginning of August, having made what probably is one of the most splendid progresses of the 16th century. But because it happened so early, and to someone whose career has been and life has been largely overlooked, I don't think it's as well known as the progresses of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. And yet, probably in its significance and magnificence, it probably exceeded both of them. Because Henry wanted his daughter, Henry VII, she was the visible part of a Tudor monarchy, which he could now say with some security was successful and was here to stay. And so she went north with this huge retinue, managed by the irascible Earl of Surrey, who viewed it as his job to get this girl to Edinburgh. The fact that she was a princess was he wasn't unaware of it, but he wasn't going to pay a great deal of attention to it. And she went north with this huge train, cartloads of clothes, of bedding, of furniture, and of religious items. And many of the great and good of the time in the train, including one Sir Thomas Boleyn, which is a fact not often known. And of course, he wasn't nearly so well known then as he would become, but he did accompany her up there. And the journey progressed north through the sort of East Midlands, through all the major towns, particularly York, where there was a huge reception and a great mass in the Minster. And in each of the places that she stopped, Margaret either went in riding her white palfrey, her pony, on side saddle on horseback, or carried in a splendidly decorated litter. And she had to go through what modern celebrities do. When you go in to be seen on TV, you don't just sit there in front of people. The makeup girl comes along, and certainly Margaret had to have her clothing and makeup changed, every time she went into one of these new places. And it must have been taxing for a girl that
Mm.
age. So constantly on show, well trained, but aware that, faux pas were not permitted of any sort. And having to deal with the Earl of Surrey, who was rude to her and rude to her servants and constantly countermanding instructions that she gave. When she finally got to Scotland, this all sort of burst out into the open because Surrey began to monopolise the attentions of James IV, just at a time when Margaret was wanting to get to know her husband, because they didn't meet until they met at Dalkeith Castle shortly after she went over the border. They would have exchanged portraits and that sort of thing, but they'd never met in person. And she writes, of course, to her father, complaining of Surrey's behaviour, and that she's worried, as she says, about how I and mine will be entreated, which just means treated, of course. And adding, I think, hugely poignantly in her own handwriting at the end of this letter, I wish I were with your grace now, now and many times more, uh, which is sad, I think.
Yes, yeah, it is. Can you introduce James IV to us in a bit more detail? From what you say, he a bit of a Lothario, but also it sounds like he was quite a, relatively speaking, a decent guy. Was he a well-liked king in
He
Scotland?
was, yes, he was a hugely popular king, both with the general populace and with his nobles, because he soon realised that if you want to govern the Scots, particularly the Scots aristocracy, successfully, you need to have a very firm hand,
Mm.
and you need to offer things which will make them want to come to you and your court. And so he deliberately set out. He was very well educated. Most of the upper class Scots were, and many of them had been educated in Europe, of course. And so they were multilingual and were well liked and respected by people who visited Scotland. But James the Fourth was a very remarkable man. I mean, yes, he was a womanizer, and of course, I think that had partly begun by his minders when he was still a very young king, in order perhaps to offer distractions. But because his father had not been like that, but he was, in every sense of the word, really a polymath. I mean, he could speak all sorts of European languages very well. He was very interested in science and all the latest technology, particularly as regarded, his army and his navy. He was interested in things like dentistry, for example, which was probably unfortunate for hapless nobles who happened to have teeth problems when they were in Scotland. But he was, and in fact, there's this famous instance in which Wolsey was sent up to Scotland on a diplomatic mission sometime in the fairly early 1500s, but after Margaret's marriage, and was told that he'd have to wait because the King of Scotland couldn't see him because he was working on how to make gunpowder at the time. So he dabbled in all sorts of things, and he did make his. It's a small court, but it's a true Renaissance court.
Mm.
And I suppose in that respect, it's a kind of microcosm of the greater Renaissance courts. But he was well loved and well respected. I mean, if the disaster at Flodden had not happened, there were indications in his reign that money might have become a problem.
Right.
And he had, although he and Margaret were both, observant Catholics and observed all the religious ceremonies and everything, he had made quite sure that the church paid their due. I mean, he knew how to manage that sort of thing. He was the last king to speak Gaelic, the last Scottish king to speak Gaelic. And he did, of course, make sure to try and bring the Highlands and Islands under firmer central control.
Mm.
So he was, I mean, I've called him, and not just me, others do too, but he was the last great king of medieval Scotland.
Right.
It died with him at Flodden, I think. And although his death was tremendously tragic, and the great loss of life that went with it. Um, it- uh, the Scots themselves have I think almost, this may offend some of my Scottish colleagues, for a long time, perhaps not anymore, they almost use this as an excuse for everything that went wrong subsequently, not just then, but much later into the 16th and 17th centuries. But yet, if you look at what happened after Flodden and what had happened before, because between the late, well, in fact, between the birth of James the First of Scotland, not of England, between the late 14th century and 1625, no Scottish monarch gained the throne as anything other than a child or a minor. And yet it is, these Scottish nobles so often presented as murderous thugs. And I've said before, and one of our leading Scottish historians said to me when I was working on Crown of Thistles, please don't represent all the Scottish nobles as murderous thugs. They weren't all like that. Many were, incidentally, but so were they were in England, if you think of the Wars of the Roses.
Yes, absolutely.
There was a strain of considerable loyalty in some of the big families to the Scottish throne, and James was able to pull this in, if you like, because he offered something that they could identify with. They wanted to be at court, and of course, the one thing that he had lacked until 1503 was a queen, and a queen consort was an important part of a successful court. She and her ladies provided the kind of sophistication and sort of gentleness that chivalry liked, which is still very much there in the 16th century. So Margaret has an important role to play, and James made sure that he trained her to play it right. And they suffered all kinds of personal tragedies during their marriage. They didn't have a child that lived beyond the age of 1 until 1512. So at the same time that Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon are trying desperately to produce children that live, so are James and Margaret.
Yeah,
But the
that's a
difference
point
there,
that's
of
often
course,
overlooked.
it is often overlooked,
Yeah.
and it is a type of rivalry. There's no doubt about it. But of course, the difference there is that Margaret was nearly 17 years younger than her husband, whereas Catherine of Aragon was nearly 6 years older than hers. And when it comes to childbearing, that has a significance. But no, I think Margaret was extraordinarily fortunate in the 10 years that she was married to James IV to have a husband who was indulgent and affectionate. All right, he wasn't faithful, but very few monarchs and people of the upper classes were in those days.
Yeah. He sounds actually quite, in a way, a bit like a Scottish Edward IV. That's,
Yes, I think that's not a bad analogy,
yeah.
actually. Yes. Though, of course, I mean, Edward IV died suddenly and unexpectedly at
Mm.
about the same age, but at least not in battle. But I think he was. I think the difference there might be that there wasn't, Edward IV started to develop and raise up a kind of lower element of the aristocracy to fulfill what we would call sort of prominent government and civil service roles, incidentally, nowadays. James IV, I don't think, did that so much. He because they didn't exist. There wasn't that sort of there were there were Scottish aristocrats who were much more important and influential and richer than others. But James didn't need and probably wouldn't have had so many people to call upon in those sort of respects. Whereas, given the civil wars in England in the 15th century, Edward was able to find a body of men that he could call upon for that sort of duty.
So you've touched on Flodden a couple of times. Things obviously go disastrously wrong for James IV at the Battle of Flodden. It results in his death. So can you just sort of explain what was this battle and how did it come to actually be in the first place?
And it came to be in the first place because relations between Henry VIII and James IV had been breaking down for several years. And there was a great deal of ill feeling. I mean, there's this sibling rivalry between Margaret and her elder brother, which probably started even back in their childhood, had reached a sort of height because Henry VIII refused to give Margaret the legacies that she was owed in Henry VII's will. He withheld what was owing to her. And she exchanged some very angry letters, saying our husband is ever the better to us, here in Scotland. Why are you such a bastard, basically. Though, of course, she didn't put it that way. And so that relationship, uh, not surprisingly, given what I said earlier, the the tension on the borders had eased for a while, but it had come back again. So that was a bone of contention on both sides. And Henry, of course, still claimed sovereignty over Scotland,
Mm.
going back to Edward I, which
First, yeah.
sat extremely ill with James IV. And then, of course, Henry and his Spanish father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon, and the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. This was shortly before, of course, Charles V had got that role, so it was Maximilian. Became involved in this league aimed at Louis XII of France to try and isolate him. Um, and Henry got involved in this war, and Louis XII, of course, called in essentially what he perceived as a diplomatic, if not actual, debt from his Scottish ally. And it was not a decision to invade England that was taken lightly. It's often said that, this was just James IV on a whim, and it was ill-advised and all that sort of thing. But in fact, it was agreed by all of the Scottish Council. And he took the largest host ever to invade England, actually, across the border in the late summer of 1513. He had, I think, the only clear aim I think he had was probably, if he could, to get to York and perhaps establish a base there, which would mean that he had Scotland and essentially a northern kingdom. And of course, he and Margaret knew very well by that time that if something happened to Henry, who had no children, of course, in 1513, then Margaret would inherit and her son. So
Mm.
he had some quite powerful motives and probably a powerful argument for trying to stay in the York area if he could have done. But of course, he had this huge army. It was difficult to supply. The supply lines went all the way back to Edinburgh, and the father, maybe he only ever got, of course, about 6 miles from Coldstream in the end. But there was terrible weather. People began, as they often did, to desert. It was a feudal type of levy. He called upon his Scottish lords to support him, which they all did, with disastrous results to many of them. He took various of the border castles, which always exchanged hands in this kind of warfare, and he got to Flodden. Though of course the battle is inaccurately named for reasons that I'll get to in a minute, and established himself there. And the Earl of Surrey had been sent north by Catherine of Aragon and the council, the same Earl who had brought Margaret up to Scotland 10 years before. He was quite elderly by that time and hugely miffed to have been told to stay in England and not
Mm.
join the others with all the fun that was going on in France. And he had a much smaller force, but they were quite maneuverable. And during the night before the Battle of Flodden, from what had seemed to be a hopeless position with James atop Flodden Ridge, Surrey, under cover of darkness and in driving rain, moved his army to a slightly different place, to below Branxton, the little village of Branxton. And of course, it was difficult for James to bring the fullness of his force very quickly to face him there. Challenged in the old medieval way, he challenged James to battle, and very impolitely. In fact, you weren't supposed to address a king in the way that he did. But the upshot of this was that James was in land that he hadn't, or on land that his spies had not checked out. He had all this huge technology, these great new cannons, which he got from Europe. He had military commanders who were French and German and Swiss. He had a huge force, but their main weapon, aside from the cannons, which were useless, essentially firing downhill, they just fired over the heads of the English force below. They couldn't get their range. So the Scottish host, barefooted, because of the mud on the hillside came down in wind and swirling rain on the afternoon of September the 13th, 1513. Sorry, September the 8th. I'm getting my 8s and 13s muddled up. And the Scots had pikes as their main instrument, but in close quarter fighting, pikes are not very helpful. They're not maneuverable enough. Whereas the English had the hedging weapon that's called the bill, and it's deadly at close range. I mean, if you use it to swipe hedges, you can use it to cut throats as well, and that's largely what they did. And what James did not know, because he had not been able to reconnoitre the land, was at the bottom of Branxton Ridge, there was a sort of muddy stream, which in the wet weather had turned it to like a bog, but you couldn't see this from up above. So as the force came down, they got caught in this and were essentially, entrapped by the much smaller English force. And most of them died in extraordinarily fierce fighting. The loss of life was absolutely terrible. I mean, there were very few Scottish nobility who did not lose a father, a brother, or a son, and sometimes all three at Flodden, and various leading clergymen. And eventually, the first part of James's attack was successful, but the follow-up was not, because these people getting stuck at the bottom of the ridge, and he had his own battle, as the different aspects of the army were called, and he must have realized, I suppose, sometime before he died, that it was hopeless. But they were trapped. He tried to get as close to Surrey as he could to see, if you can kill the opposite commander. Sometimes that has an effect. But he was cut down. He had an arrow in his jaw, and his throat was cut. And he fell alongside his eldest illegitimate son, and so with him did, what have subsequently been called the Flowers of the Forest. The Flowers of the Forest, incidentally, is maybe an old poem, but the music that it's set to and the poem itself probably date from the early 18th century, and it's sort of part of Scottish folklore that it dates from Flodden. It is about Flodden, but it doesn't date from that time. And so this battle, which took place on a remote hillside in northern England, which you can still visit, incidentally, and it is well worth a visit if you go up there. It's just 6 miles south of Coldstream, of the border there. And you can climb the hill, and they've got plaques, along the top, which show you the disposition of the Scottish and English forces. And it's still slightly muddy down at the bottom in wet weather. But it is one of the least known and most tragic and significant, I think, of battles that ever took place on English soil.
I mean, obviously, it's a major loss for Scotland. It's a major loss for Margaret, because she's widowed at the age of just 24. What impact did it have on Margaret's relationship with her brother and also Catherine of Aragon?
We don't know what relationship it had, what effect it had on her relationship with her brother as such, because of course he wasn't there. I mean, this is a victory that had taken place in his absence. And both Surrey and eventually Catherine of Aragon, when she wised up to the fact that going on and on and on about it might not be a very good idea, decided to downplay it in the end, because Henry hadn't been involved in anything remotely similar in northern France. There'd been this so-called Battle of the Spurs, in which they chased a few French horsemen, and that was about it. So it wouldn't have been clever to point out to Henry that there's been this huge victory over there which he hadn't been part of. But we don't know how it affected his relationship with Margaret. I mean, over the years, I don't suppose it would have done it any good at all. There are some clues as to how it affected the relationship with Catherine of Aragon, because, of course, Catherine, desperate to demonstrate to her husband that she'd been on top of all of this and a leading light in it, though actually she'd never done anything more than review a few troops in Buckinghamshire, and help make banners, the very kind of feminine thing to do, a bit of sewing. she sent this peculiarly distasteful and bloodthirsty letter to Henry VIII saying she'd, hoped to send James IV's body to him, but her political advisors didn't think that this was a very nice idea. So instead, she was sending him James IV's bloody surcoat, which was the one that he'd been wearing when he died. At the same time, she apparently offered to send a friar up to her sister-in-law to comfort her, though Margaret had plenty of such people of her own. And we don't actually know the detail of Margaret's response, but it seems to have been the modern equivalent of bugger off, basically. And it's hard to know how it impacted the relationship. They had known each other before because they'd met at Arthur's wedding when Arthur married Catherine. But it would have been only a fairly temporary thing. And Margaret was quite, of course, still a child, really, at the time. Margaret did, when everything fell apart for her in Scotland after James IV's death in 1516, she, right at the end of 1515, she fled across the border into England, and she was 8 months pregnant with the child by her second husband at the time. She obviously spent nearly a year in London with Margaret, with her sister Mary and with Catherine of Aragon. We don't really know what passed between them. It appears, at least on the surface, to have been amicable. But one thing that is interesting is that Margaret seems to have stayed out of the whole business of the divorce, partly because she was trying to get divorced herself at the time, and her brother and Wolsey had the nerve to sort of tell her that this was no way for a lady to behave, while at the same time trying to get rid of Catherine of Aragon. She took this rather ill, as you can imagine. But there are some indications that she at least tried to foster a closer relationship with Anne Boleyn. We know that they exchanged gifts. We don't know what the gifts were because we looked and tried to find them, but the warrant books are missing for that time. But they are referred to in passing in documents at the time. We don't know precisely what those were. This may have been the fairly sort of perfunctory thing that monarchs did with each other. But clearly, Margaret did not criticise the divorce and was at some pains to try and develop a more positive relationship with Henry's second wife. What she thought about the execution of Anne Boleyn, we have no idea.
It's quite telling, though, I think.
Yes, and she would have been wise to have kept quiet about it anyhow, of course. But
yeah.
So no, I suspect that the relationship with Catherine of Aragon was perhaps rather strained, at least under the surface.
Yeah.
I don't see how it could not have been.
Totally. And I think that maybe also makes it kind of makes sense as to why she was perhaps more willing to show some degree of respect or even potential favour to Anne Boleyn in the way that we know her younger sister, Princess Mary, resolutely did not. Which is quite telling. So you mentioned a moment ago about the fact that Margaret marries for a second time. She marries reasonably quickly after being widowed, I believe. So who was
a year?
A year. Okay. So who was her second husband? How did he come into the picture, and so on?
Well, we don't actually know how he came into the picture. He had not been at Flodden. He's Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus. And while some of the Douglas family were killed at Flodden, we don't really know why he wasn't there. You see, Margaret is often, I think, perhaps the most negative of all the comments that are made about Margaret is what is described as the stupidity and sort of unseemliness of this second marriage. But there are certain things you have to remember. Margaret was pregnant with her final child by James IV at the time of the Battle of Flodden. So although James had left her as regent for their son, he had done so with the proviso that she did not remarry. And certainly for the best part of a year, she abided by that. But the pregnancy, as it gathered pace, obviously meant that she couldn't attend council meetings as frequently as she would have liked. She did attend as many as she could by the sound of it. But also, soon after James IV's death, there was a move by some of the Scottish lords to approach James IV's cousin, John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who had been born and brought up in France and was in the service, in fact, of Francis I, to ask whether he could come across as governor, despite the fact that Margaret had been named as regent. So she knew all along that there was a group, a phalanx of people, if you like, amongst the Scottish lords, whose loyalty to her was probably at best flexible and could be removed almost at the drop of a hat. I mean, they did say again that they would serve her during the summer of 1515, after her second son with James was born. But she had been partly removed from the centre of events. She was clearly nervous about what the future might hold with this Frenchman lurking in the shadows, as it were. And she seems to have come under the influence. While living at Stirling Castle, which she was at the time, the keeper of the castle was a relative of the Earl of Angus on his mother's side. And we don't know how they met, the two of them, Margaret and Angus. We have no idea. All we know is that this secret wedding took place outside Perth in early August 1515. And once it was known, Margaret almost immediately lost the regency. The general feeling now, I think, amongst a number of Scottish historians, and it's one which I have echoed, is that given Margaret's circumstances and her feeling obviously of insecurity, pressure may have been brought to bear on her by the combined forces on both sides of the family of the Drummonds and the Douglases. Here is a suitable young man, a very prominent landowner. He had no experience of government. He didn't join the council until about April of 1515, who would make you an ideal husband. And Margaret is often criticised for this. There's this splendid saying in one book came out some years ago, calling it a moment of womanly weakness, which I find peculiarly off-putting, because it was probably, if it was weakness, it was probably fear for her own future rather than. Angus was about her age. He wasn't a toy boy. They were almost exactly the same age. And he, like her, had just lost a spouse. His first wife had died the previous year, probably in childbirth. We don't know that for sure, but quite possibly. So they were both widowed. And Margaret, I suppose, had to balance whether allying herself with one of the most powerful families in Scotland was worth the risk of alienating many of the Scottish nobles, as against the possibility of trying to cling on and finding herself just increasingly pushed out anyhow by the fact that a French-born alternative was favoured. And she obviously opted for Angus, perhaps because she felt it would still give her more control over the situation, whereas someone coming in from France, who was a direct relative of James, her little son, James V, would not. It was, of course, in retrospect, a disastrous decision. She did lose the the regency. She might have lost it anyhow, I think is the point I'm trying to make. Mm-hmm. What is not so clear, though Albany did, when he came, eventually take away the two children from her as well, what is not so clear was if she had played her cards a bit more cannily, whether she could have agreed to give up the regency but retain control of the children, at least on a more sort of maternal as opposed to political basis. And the reason that I think this may have been a lesson learned subsequently was that her daughter-in-law, Mary of Guise, did not fight for the regency once her husband, James V, died. But she did make absolutely certain that she kept Mary, Queen of Scots, close to her. And I think it's interesting to speculate whether this is something she learnt from her mother-in-law's experience. If she did, she applied it very wisely, and was in a rather different situation, of course. Whereas, her daughter was a queen, which was always a problem. Whereas James V was a male. But no, I mean, and eventually Margaret felt so threatened by the entire situation that she did flee over the border into Northumberland, where she gave birth to her only daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas, and eventually was able to travel down to London to spend time with her brother and her sister and sister-in-law again. But Henry didn't really want the inconvenience or expense of having her there for too long. So after about barely a year there, he sent her back up to Scotland. I don't think Margaret would have minded this had Henry not so obviously and constantly sided with Angus against her. I mean, you have to, I think, really understand the dynamics of sort of male and female politics in those days. Henry VIII always took the view that women were inferior, and his sister was no exception. Had he behaved, and Wolsey as his advisor, more had he been willing to even, consider the possibility of working with Margaret, it is quite possible that he could have, with her assistance, gained control of the whole of the British Isles quite readily, instead of constantly, criticizing her, attacking her, siding with her second husband, whom she if she had been in love with in the first place, and I think that's a big if, she fairly soon fell out of love with, because Angus stole Margaret's monies that were due to her revenues from her dower lands. I mean, he did have affairs with other women, but I don't think that was the primary reason that Margaret came to dislike him so. He represented her brother's belittling of her and was a danger to her continued position and her relationship with her son. I think that was far more of a motivation, and plus which they just really grew to dislike each other quite intensely. He didn't accompany her down to London. He pushed off back. He was always more concerned, I think, Adam, about his position in Scotland. That was what concerned him. And if it required making his peace with the Duke of Albany, who was then there as regent, then he was quite happy to do that. And what happened to his wife was unfortunate, but he wasn't going to care about it.
I think one of the big differences, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the big differences I think that in the landscape of Scotland and England, as far as the way that nobility worked, which obviously had its massive implications on Margaret's second marriage in particular. Yes, there was factionalism in England, but Scotland really, it was the clans, wasn't it? It was these clans that were these huge families that controlled so much. And to your point a moment ago, if you married one, you kind of offended the other, and it was almost an impossible balance, I think.
It was a very difficult balance. I mean, the clans per se were centred on the Highlands, the great families, the Humes, the Douglases, and several others in the borders and the sort of Lothians, that part of Scotland, were not clans in the sense that the Scottish clans, like Campbells and MacDonalds and all that sort of thing, were. They were just hugely powerful local families. So in that respect, they are a bit more like hugely powerful families in England or in France or wherever. So yes, I mean, there were so many embedded interests there. And of course, you've got to bear in mind through all of this that Margaret, no matter how much she had learnt Scots, there's a dispute, still goes on, I think, about whether it's a separate language, but it was a separate language. It had some English words, but a lot of quite different ones. She'd learnt to write it and dictate it. But still, of course, and particularly with her brother being across the border like he was, I think she was always still viewed as an Englishwoman. She wasn't the first English queen consort in Scotland. There had been others before her, and they had had similar difficulties. And I mentioned this in another podcast I did recently, but I think it's indicative. I've been thrilled by the reviews that my book has had here in England, but it hasn't been reviewed in Scotland at all. My book, no, not that I'm aware of. Whereas my book Crown of Thistles was reviewed in Scotland by several of the Scottish papers. And I'm not quite sure why this is, because whether you like it or not, she was Queen of Scots. She's Margaret Tudor, Queen of Scots. And she played an important role in the 16th century dynamic of diplomacy between the two countries, because she never gave up on trying to improve relations between the two countries. She was used in diplomatic endeavours by both the Scots and the English, during the long period of her life after James IV's death. And she knew a great deal about how to conduct diplomacy as well. And I suppose you could argue that ultimately she wasn't successful, which is true. But that's a judgment with hindsight. At the time, she was viewed as an important player in this respect. And much of this has only really come to light after a major doctoral thesis was written about 6 or 7 years ago, which looked at her letters, because more of Margaret's letters survive than any other Tudor monarch. By a long degree. And of course, there must be many, many more that are lost. She was an inveterate letter writer. She perhaps had more of what we might call a stream of consciousness style nowadays. But she was an inveterate letter writer, and she knew how to use all of the tricks of the trade in diplomacy, to write a letter in her own hand, to write a dictated letter, but with a handwritten postscript, which might contain some quite important information, or to have a memorial, which was a particular type of diplomatic. Well, it was almost like a performance. You would actually have had, a letter or a script. Probably a script is the more likely way of referring to it. And she had a couple of trusted men that she used to send to Henry and Wolsey to deliver these. And they would have discussed with Margaret what they were supposed to emphasize, how they should react, blah, blah, blah. And their job was to start out with this material, almost like a performance, and then to take clues from the body language of Henry VIII as to how and when they should continue it. And, to change track if necessary. And Margaret uses this quite a lot in her diplomatic correspondence. So she was quite a canny lady, and I think, even if it's easy to criticize her third marriage was a disaster as well. I suppose there weren't that many choices really. The marriage that succeeded was the one that was arranged for her. Her third marriage was to Henry Stuart, who was there were many Stuarts in Scotland. He was one of them, well, junior branch, and he'd been a member of her household. He was a bit younger than her, but only about 6 years younger. And she does, perhaps for the first time in her life, seem to have fallen in love, which is very sad because he soon started running off with other women and pinching her money as well. And it's all very well to say, well, why doesn't she do something about this? What can she do unless either Henry VIII or, in the second case, her son James V, intervene and say, stop this and repay what you are essentially stealing. She did go to law on many occasions and appeared in person, to argue her case. But it was very difficult to do, and it impinged on her role as queen and how she would like to have been seen, because she always wanted, when she met her little son, of whom she was very fond, actually. She was probably fonder of her male children than of Margaret Douglas. But she always wanted him to think, this is a queen, this is my mother. She's splendidly dressed, she's wearing all her jewels. This is, and so many people criticize Margaret for being obsessed with clothing and jewelry. But, as a queen, this is something you need to be obsessed with.
Yeah, it's her armor.
It is, exactly. If you think of Henry VIII's wives, I can't think of any one of them that wasn't pretty much obsessed with clothing and jewelry either.
Catherine Parr in particular.
Yes, exactly.
In many ways, I've often felt that Mary Queen of Scots almost repeated a lot of her grandmother's, not mistakes, but if we're saying to ourselves, in some respects, she couldn't pick 'em, Margaret here, with regard to her second and third husband, her granddaughter then makes very similar mistakes in some respects, which I think is quite an interesting thing to consider.
Well, I suppose Mary was restricted in who she could marry anyhow. The marriage to Francis II of France was arranged and seems to be more of a sort of affectionate sibling match than anything else. But certainly she had no control over that. She is often criticised for the Darnley marriage, but actually the Darnley marriage made a lot of sense dynastically. He had a claim to the throne of England and Scotland as well. And it's often said, oh, well, how could she have done this? She must have known him in France, but we don't really know whether she might have seen him at the French court, but one hardly imagines that they sat around, on footstools having a great tete-a-tete. I don't know of myself, someone may well correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know of any sort of major contact that she had with Darnley while he was in France. She soon realized, of course, what an awful person and disaster he was. But marriage to Bothwell is capable of very various interpretations. But even at the most critical of Mary, I think there is a lot of evidence that she was coerced into marrying him, and that probably fairly soon after whether he raped her in the literal sort of physical sense, throwing her on a bed, we don't know. But obviously there was sexual contact and she became pregnant very soon after that with twins, yes. And I think a lot of people, it's all very well to say, well, why didn't she repudiate him? Would you have wanted to be a queen regnant with twins by some man you had repudiated? I don't think, this would have encouraged people to admire you very much necessarily. It's a very difficult situation. I mean, what it almost certainly was not, the Bothwell marriage, is this lovey-dovey stuff that you see in the old Vanessa Redgrave, Nigel Davenport film. I mean, you don't even see that in the more recent film with
Saoirse Ronan.
Yeah, with Saoirse Ronan. You don't see that at all. And I think that's much more accurate. But I think perhaps it's just indicative of how difficult it was for women to rule, and the fact that they were expected to marry, but that were always downsides, no matter who you married. And yet, of course, Elizabeth I is always given this huge amount of credit for never marrying anyone, though there's ample evidence that during the 1560s there were serious marriage negotiations, and probably, if the circumstances were right, she might certainly have married Robert Dudley, and she might have married the Archduke Charles of Austria as well. I think, again, we're looking back on the past and thinking, oh, wasn't she clever? But was she? I mean, she didn't have it.
Or was she just very cautious?
Yeah, she was just very, but also, she had no heir. Having an heir is a double-edged sword, as Mary Queen of Scots found. It means you can be replaced. Margaret in that position wasn't quite so disadvantageous because she'd only ever been a queen regent, and she had an affectionate relationship with her son. I mean, he eventually grew fed up with her marital problems and said, okay, mummy, enough, basically. But they do seem to have had a very close relationship. And her entire life, and this is a point I would like to sort of make to finish off, Adam, is that her entire life after James IV's death was dedicated to ensuring that her son became king in his own right.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the coup in 1524.
Yes, well, that was an even more interesting one in 1528, of course. I mean, that was caused by Angus overstepping the mark in Scotland and falling out with the Earl of Arran, who also had a slightly more distant claim to the Scottish throne. And it gave Margaret an opportunity to come back into the picture. But it didn't last for very long because she was forced, I think, to agree with this really extraordinarily naive view of the Scottish Council, that as James V, well, technically at the age of 12, he had been declared, of age to rule, but he wasn't in practice. And so they would have a kind of advisory council on a 3-month rotating basis throughout the year, in which different lords would be in charge of him. And of course, who is the first person to be this but Archibald Douglas, Earl of Angus? And when it came his turn to give it up, he just refused and kept James under very close scrutiny. I mean, James hated him and he hated all of the Douglases. But eventually he did break free. I mean, it's very hard. Douglas was good at sort of stirring trouble in Scotland and shoving himself into the mix. What he was not good at was holding on to power. Clearly, he didn't really know how to do that. And circumstances were always against him. And his estranged wife was waiting in the wings to pick up the pieces when they fell apart. But by 1528, James was old enough to rule by himself, and he just rode out of Falkland Palace one night in secret, went to Stirling, where Margaret was holed up, and declared himself king. And Douglas and his brother fled over the border back into the probably not so welcoming arms of Henry VIII, and that was it. And thereafter, James managed to rule. Again, he really awaits a very good biographer, I think. He's an interesting man. He's often criticized, for the way he ruled and the fact that he had more mistresses and more illegitimate children than his father. But again, he did manage to have a very glittering Renaissance court. He was viewed as a player in Europe by both the Holy Roman Emperor and by Francis I in France. And his death, which followed, of course, not at a battle, but after it, was probably because of disease that he picked up while on campaign. His death is very, very sad as well. But Margaret had predeceased him by a year. I think if she had known how soon he would die after she died, she would have been very, very sad.
That sets up very nicely what I was about, sort of my next question, which is what were Margaret's final years like? Where was she? Do we know what her eventual cause of death was?
Yeah, we do. We know some things about this. She separated from her third husband by the time that her son went wooing Princess Madeleine of France. And she'd been sort of in and out of court. James V had made her third husband, he'd given him the title of Earl Methven, and they had a castle which is outside Perth. And Margaret did live there for part of the time. But when she was at court to receive Madeleine, when Madeleine arrived, which of course poor Madeleine was consumptive and died within 6 weeks of arriving in Scotland, and James V didn't waste much time in finding a replacement. And he married, of course, Marie de Guise as his second wife. And it seems to have been perhaps through the influence of Mary of Guise that Margaret Tudor spent much of her final years at court. She wasn't there the whole time, but she was there quite a lot of the time. And she seems to have got on very well with her daughter-in-law. There seems to have been quite a lot of mutual affection and respect. And as I said elsewhere, Margaret Tudor's last great gift to her son, the son to whom she had really devoted her life, was in tragic circumstances in the spring of 1541. The two infant sons of Mary of Guise and James V died within days of each other, not in the same place, incidental. And the parents were utterly traumatized. I mean, even in days when we often think, children died all the time, presumably they just think, tough, we'll have another. I mean, clearly, under such circumstances, you'd have to have a heart of stone as a parent not to be severely upset, and they undoubtedly were. And Margaret spent quite a lot of time at court comforting them. In the autumn of 1541, she went back to Methven Castle. And in the October that she was there, she had a stroke. She doesn't seem to have realized how seriously ill she was to begin with, which of course is not untypical of people who have strokes. Even nowadays, initially you can't always tell how serious it is. And when she realized that she was dying, she sent for James V, but he was at Falkland and couldn't get to her in time. But the court did observe mourning in Scotland. Henry VIII did not. He completely ignored. He sent someone north to find out whether Margaret had left a will, which she hadn't. Which again is fairly typical of Henry VIII. And of course, his last act of spite against his sister was to cut out her line altogether in his will.
Yes,
of course, that didn't stand over any period of time, because eventually, when the Tudor line ran out, it was going to be the Stuarts that took over. I mean, there were some very distant prospects, but they were either unwelcome or just too unrealistic. So I think the point I'd like to end on, and which I've said in a number of other podcasts I've made on this, is that I'm always rather glad. It took 100 years after their marriage, James IV and Margaret Tudor, but it is Margaret's line that still sits on the throne of the United Kingdom.
Yes, I was going to ask you what is her legacy, and I knew that's what you would say.
That is her legacy, yes. And it's still there today. And of that, I think she would be hugely proud. This woman who she's been derided by quite even female historians, which I thought we had grown out of this thing, but apparently we haven't still in many respects, because, people who write off these sort of little brief biographies of people like Margaret Tudor, just use whatever is there, and they don't think about subject very much or look at it in a wider context. But she has been unfairly derided. I'm not saying that she was a lovable person. I don't think she was necessarily. She would have been a difficult woman to get along with, I think. But you have to admire her constancy and the fact that she did stand up to her brother, and her parting words to one of his ambassadors, not long before she died, was, that she never heard from Henry, and that it would have been but a small thing to have spent some paper and ink on me.
I know. I think that's, in some respects, one of the wonderful... There's a couple of amazing pieces of cosmic karma that bites Henry VIII in the arse, and it's the fact that it's his older sister who he essentially casts off, that it's her line that's still on the throne to this day, and of course that the daughter from the woman who he had executed goes on to supersede him in many people's eyes as the greatest of the Tudor monarchs. It's these sort of the fact that it's two women really who... That I think that's just the most fantastic bit of karma. That if Henry VIII were alive today, it would just be a wonderful thing to point out to him, I think.
So I'd make sure your head was some distance from him if you did.
Very much. Well, that brings us to the end of the discussion. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing Margaret's fascinating story with us. This has been a really interesting conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Adam.
And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks again to Linda Porter for coming onto the show to discuss her latest book with us. As a teaser for the coming weeks, I have episodes in the pipeline which explore the recent discoveries of two portraits of notable Tudors, one being Henry VIII and the other Lady Arbella Stuart, and conversations with Cynthia Hand, the author behind the popular My Lady Jane book series, and of course the recent TV adaptation, and also a discussion with Elizabeth Fremantle about her book Queen's Gambit, which of course has been adapted into a major film, Firebrand, starring Alicia Vikander and Jude Law as Catherine Parr and Henry VIII, respectively. These episodes will be dropping across August and September. If you have any requests or suggestions for future episodes, please do reach out. I will be delighted to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.